I got to say, Eric, I love the music you're playing today. You are right on there. Hey, folks, you are listening to Where You Live with Gene and Tony. It's good to have you with us. We're broadcasting from the Concierge Landscape Studios. We're brought to you by Extreme Exteriors and American Family Insurance, the Kim Bennett Agency. We were talking in our last segment about this story out of Stockton, California. You've all heard about it, one of the largest cities to date to file bankruptcy. We are talking with our friend of the show, attorney Dan Greenstein from Bernick Lifson. And Dan, we're talking a little bit about bankruptcy and how that might be for a city, but let's turn it to a little bit smaller governance. A homeowner association. I don't know that I've ever been involved with an HOA that has filed bankruptcy. Have you heard of an HOA doing that?
I have not personally been involved. However, I have seen a number of them in the Minnesota area, up in northern Minnesota, and I've read some stories about them on both coasts. So it does happen, and like you suggest, an association is like a small business or a small city, and when you don't take in enough money to pay your obligations, if you can't stop those obligations or reduce them, what happens?
Yeah.
You run out of money.
Yeah.
You know, and there's kind of a fine line that those in authority who are have authority with the budget have to deal with. One is you've got some of those services that must be provided for the residents, for its members, that you can't get away from. But then you also have instances where people clearly spent money because they really don't understand a budget. People get to, I think, sometimes to looking at numbers that are so large, it's meaningless to them. And they almost see it as sort of a never-ending bucket. And they say, well, this project's only a few $100s. But you add all of that up, and pretty soon you're talking about a big chunk of the budget.
Yeah. You know, my partner, Jeff, speaks of the lottery in that way. He's like, win $100,000, win $1 million. It's all the same to me.
Well, I tell my wife you'd be just as happy winning $1 million as $100 million.
There you go. It's same idea.
You know, one of the things I've noticed in the last year in many associations is that they have a budget, they have a proposed plan, and what happens is because of the number of people losing their jobs and the number of people in foreclosure, the income dries up. And it's not a situation where they spent too much or they kept spending without planning. It's a situation where they were counting on an income of a certain amount, and due to the real estate market and the economy, a large portion of that income never materialized.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It doesn't necessarily mean that the funds were not handled correctly or that they overspent. It's the other end that's a problem. The income is not coming in.
Exactly. And honestly, when people get into financial trouble and they're struggling with, let's say their mortgage payment or medical bills or something, they tend to not pay their homeowner association dues.
Yeah.
It never seems to be the squeaky wheel, at least before legal action has started.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's amazing. I've talked to countless people who are involved with credit counseling with individuals, and they said that a very common practice with people, like you say, that when they really get to that end of that precipice and they realize that they're ready to fall, people don't just start thinking rationally and say, well, here are the basics. Let me do at least all the basics that I can.
Yeah.
People go out and say, well, it's all going anyway, and they end up spending more frivolously than they had before.
Before they file.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, dear.
It's I can see why it's tempting, but it's really you're on dangerous ground by doing that, because if your debts are large enough or you have enough creditors looking over your spending before you file bankruptcy, they can challenge your bankruptcy if you took advantage of them once you were insolvent.
Yeah, that's a real good good thing to bring up. I don't think people realize that. People have seen that. That's even true with homeowner associations. If they're dealing with an individual who's filing bankruptcy, if there is a lot of frivolous spending that person is doing, it allows the creditors to go back in and ask that the bankruptcy be lifted.
That's right.
Interesting.
It doesn't happen that often because typically the creditors are so used to people filing bankruptcy now that they're not closely examining it. But I do remember, maybe 10 years ago or so, where it was a common practice for banks, when somebody filed bankruptcy on them on a line of credit, for banks to do a thorough investigation to see if they were taken advantage of in the months before the bankruptcy.
Yeah. I suppose the bank is in a unique position, though. They can they review checking accounts and things like that?
Oh, sure.
See where money was spent.
Oh,
they
sure.
have kind of an inside perspective there.
Well, let me ask you this, Dan. When it comes to a homeowners association, if they were to file for bankruptcy, I would imagine there's going to be some homeowners will have thinking somewhere along this. They say, well, I've been making my payments all along, but a lot of people haven't. And even though there's that obligation, the bankruptcy, if the HOA files for bankruptcy, doesn't mean that the homeowner has an end to their obligation to the association, but people would probably say, that's just tough. I'm going to just stop making my payments anyway.
Well, here's what happens. If an association files for bankruptcy, with the oversight of the bankruptcy court and the bankruptcy trustee, all of the assets are garnered together and reviewed. All of the liabilities are put together and reviewed. And the court will typically use those assets, liquidate them. I mean, in an association, it's usually just the checking and savings account.
Yeah.
They'll take that money, they'll proportionately pay off all the debt, and they'll say all the rest of the remaining debts are wiped out. They're terminated.
I see.
But going forward, what has to happen then, the association really has to come up with a new association to govern the platted development. And that new association has to have new governing documents, a new name, new board members, new due payment schedules, and new policies and procedures.
Wow. That's unexpected. I would never have thought of that.
Yeah, because the old bankruptcy, the old association has in effect failed and terminated.
Wow.
And in fact, in order to file bankruptcy, the association members, at least 80% of them, have to vote to do it because essentially you're terminating your association.
Yeah.
And then you've got to start over.
Wow.
But you think about all that's involved to have something like that happen. I guess I can see why that's nothing to have taken lightly. What would be your guess? How many associations probably have filed bankruptcy in maybe the last 5-6 years just here in Minnesota, would you guess?
I would say...
just a handful?
I'm going to guess somewhere between 8 and 12.
Okay.
Is what I've heard about. And I'm not really tuned into the bankruptcy filings.
Yeah.
But that's what comes to mind when I think of the likely numbers.
Yeah. You know, I don't know if you heard our first story, but it was about an association that sounds like they're going to go bankrupt because they have a landlord who owns 11 units who's $133,000 in arrears to the association. We were talking about steps the association should take long before they have an owner in that trouble. And one, of course, is the association can foreclose on these units. You know, Dan, you've spoken about this subject where we've advised associations to foreclose and then rent out the unit so they can get dues. But, man, on the scale we're talking about, you would end up being a board of directors that runs a rental property.
Yes, you would.
Yeah. Wouldn't you?
You would. I liked your advice of going to conciliation court in stages and getting judgments and levying against the rent.
Yeah.
Perfect answer, perfect plan. There's another one. One of the things that I'm commonly doing in this day and age, when we amend the declaration of various associations, we put in a provision that basically says any owner that is renting out their unit gives the association a power of attorney and an assignment of any rents that are due to that landlord owner. It's much like a bank. If it makes a loan to me to buy some space that I rent out, the bank's going to say, okay, Dan, we want an assignment of those rents and leases so that if you're behind or you default, we can go to your tenants and take the money.
Yeah.
Put that in the declaration.
Okay. Do you think that could be part of a rental policy in an association, or do you think it would have to be incorporated into the declaration?
It has to be incorporated into the declaration.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, that's something that you just couldn't do just with
by rule.
By rule.
Well, the other way you could do it, but it's practically impossible, is to have the landlord sign something.
And just agree to it.
An assignment.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for taking some time to be with us today on the show.
You are welcome.
Take care. Stay cool.
Everything you have to say. Okay. Folks, that was Dan Greenstein from Bernick Lifson. Always great advice from him.
He's so thoughtful. He's really thought things through. I love
Well, hey, don't go away, folks. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we've got one more segment left on today's show of Where You Live with Gene and Tony.